Introducing Minor Wisdom Quintet.
1, 2, a skidda-didda-doo.
Minor Wisdom.
My mother always told me that if you wanted something, just go get it. Just go. So I was sitting at my computer, and one of the ways that I figure out who I want to interview or just people that I'd like to have on the podcast is I go to the UIL Facebook page or the Texas Theater Exchange or just one of those pages, and I scroll through. And I was doing that one day, and Don Nigro's name was on there. He's a member of one of the pages. I don't remember which one, but he is a member of one of the pages, and I was like, Don Nigro? Like, Don Nigro, like 400 plus plays Don Nigro? Don Nigro, like I just produced one of his shows for our one-act play Don Nigro? Don Nigro, like the first show I ever produced as an educator Don Nigro? Yeah, that Don Nigro. And so I thought, what is it going to hurt? I'm going to reach out to him. I'm going to ask him if he would be a guest on the podcast. And he, within 30 minutes, replied, sure, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. Here we are. This week, I've got Don Nigro on the podcast. One of the greatest American playwrights ever, and still living a great life and still producing plays and a living legend in the world of theater. Mr. Don Nigro's on this week's podcast. I'm not going to give a long introduction. I'm not going to do an opinion this week. I'm not going to do any of that stuff because I want to get straight to the interview. I do want to say that I saw that some people left me a 5-star review on iTunes and left comments and all this kind of stuff. Please, 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 if you are enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star review. I've also learned this past week, because it was my spring break, this past week I interviewed quite a few people. I interviewed Travis Poe, Rachel Maddox, Jackie Kanya, my superintendent, of course, Don Nigro. I interviewed a number of other people to get on this podcast, to get ahead, to get things in the can so that I'm not constantly every week looking for things. But what I learned is that people are listening. Oh, Larry Balfe, oh my gosh, that interview was amazing. But I learned that people are listening to who they want to listen to, and that's not a complaint. That's great. But what I want to hear from you all is, who do you want to hear? Who's going to tickle your fancy? I can't say that I can reach out to David Mamet or a bunch of living playwrights that are currently producing shows and writing plays. I can try. I've actually done that with quite a few people. But Don Nigro was just very nice enough. My English not so good. My English not very good. He was just so nice and perfect to get on this podcast, and I really appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at Mr. Blake Minor. Friend me on Facebook. If you want to be my friend, you got a friend in me. Hey, but just, I really appreciate those people that are listening to this podcast and those people that have been here from day one. And finally, I get, not that I haven't had in the theater world big stars, but like, this is a really super niche podcast for Texas theater educators. And everybody I've had on is tied to Texas in some way. Don Nigro is not. He's not tied to Texas. He's just a huge deal. Please enjoy this week's podcast interview with Mr. Don Nigro.
I've been doing this for about 50 years. I've written 470 some plays. They've been produced in every state and in countries all over the world in many different languages. And that's how I make a living.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it.
And what is behind you right now? I know this isn't a video podcast, but you have a very busy library behind you. Are those works that inspire you, or are those your works, or those, what are those?
This whole wall behind me is all books. Okay. And this right behind me happens to be some of the oldest books I have, which are the Ballantine Chamber of Horrors paperbacks, okay, which I read when I was about 10 or 11. Zacherley's Vulture Stew, Zacherley's Midnight Snacks, The Other Passenger by John Keir Cross, which I highly recommend.
Okay.
This is a book that influenced me enormously as a kid. They're paperbacks with very lurid covers by John Powers that I just loved, and they really sort of introduced me to the adult world.
Right.
I didn't grow up in a place where we had a lot of books. I mean, my parents bought me kids' books and stuff, but once I started getting past that, I had to find my own stuff. So I accumulated a lot of stuff at the drugstore. And in those days, you could buy good books at the drugstore.
Yeah.
You could buy Hemingway, Hemingway, D.H. Lawrence, all kinds of people like that. And so this is basically the remains of my childhood exploration into the adult world of science fiction, horror, mystery, Sherlock Holmes, and stuff that formed to me.
Are there any books that you wish you had kept? Like you thought, eventually, I don't need this anymore, but now in hindsight, you wish you'd still had held on to?
Well, I used to trade books with my friend, and I also used to sell books when I was in college, textbooks and things. And one of the things that the internet is wonderful for is I can now get those books back.
Right.
And that's what I do.
Right.
So and the further back in my life, the better. So I have been acquiring used copies of books that I read when I was 11 or 12, which made an impression on me, but which somehow disappeared from my life. And it's pretty interesting. It's like archaeology.
Right.
Archaeology of the soul.
Right. So I did want to ask you, I read a little bit about who inspired you and who influenced you. Are there any inspirations that were you able to meet, that you were able to kind of meet them and let them know that they are some of the reason you became a playwright, and the type of style that you write? Any of those people were you able to shake their hand and say hello to?
Nope.
No, not a one, huh?
No, I've
That's
never met
surprising.
Tom Stoppard. I
Okay.
never got a chance. I did get it. I did actually. The closest I ever got to one of my writer heroes was when I went to London and saw Harold Pinter in a production of his play The Collection at the
Okay.
Donmar Warehouse, where you're very close. And I always sat in the front row in London. Even at the National Theatre, the cheapest tickets are the front row for some reason. And I like the front row because, one, I don't have very good eyes, and two, I love to watch actors work.
Right.
I love to watch them work closely. So at the Donmar Warehouse, I got within 2 feet of Harold Pinter because he was sitting at a desk in the play watching him, and that was the closest I
That's
ever got to it.
it. Okay. Well, hey.
But I went to the National and saw Ian McKellen and sat in the front row, and that's an education.
Right.
Just watching that guy work is just amazing. Every single moment, beautifully crafted, totally natural, as if he was just making it up as he was going along.
Right.
And he'd done this like 50 times.
Right.
That was a great education. So no, I haven't met any of those guys. I never met Shakespeare or.
Right. Well, yeah, I know that one I assumed.
Yeah, but the modern guys that I would have enjoyed talking to are Tom Stoppard, who was actually still alive.
Right.
The early plays of Edward Bond were very influential on me. I love Pinter and Beckett, and a guy named Peter Barnes, who wrote The Ruling Class and a bunch of other wonderful plays. I think Peter Barnes' work is closer to mine than any of those guys.
Yeah.
Some of Stoppard. But they're mostly British.
Yeah.
Or Irish.
Yeah, not from these parts. And so that gets me to, you are from and still live in Ohio, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there something that has kept you in Ohio that is kind of, just, is it homely? Is it just for you? Is it kind of your land? Is it, that kind of idea?
Well, I lived in a small town near here until I was 5, and then we moved to Arizona, where we'd come back here every summer to visit relatives. And once I went off to college, I was pretty much gone for a long time. I would come back here to visit my father, who raised me, but I was mostly traveling around, being a grad student, being a playwright, directing, acting, doing stuff like that for years. And I just come back here on holidays, sometimes in the summer, whenever I didn't have to be somewhere else. I was a wandering playwright for a long time. And I really didn't like that.
Yeah.
I liked being in rehearsal.
Yeah.
I liked being around the theater. I loved sitting in the green room talking to the actors. I loved watching the play develop. I loved, getting my fingers deep into the production and being involved in everything. But I didn't really like traveling, and I didn't like being away from having a sense of home. I always wished I had more of a sense of home. So I did that for like 25, 30 years or something. It was a wandering playwright. When my father got older, my father was a disabled veteran. He was wounded in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. And as he got older, he had problems getting around. He had a very bad leg with lots of shrapnel, had torn it up. So I moved back here to look after my dad, to help him out, and then later on to look after him, be a caregiver for a number of years. And for a while, I was still able to travel a little, but not much. He left me this house, and I got an awful lot of work done here. Because all of my books were here, instead of me just coming back periodically, dumping a few books and then going out again. And I found that I didn't want to leave. I found that there's a sense of peace here. And also, by this point in my career, I was making enough money to actually live off the royalties from plays. Earlier on, for the first 25 years or so, most of my income came from teaching at universities, doing artist in residence things, directing. Once in a while, I would act in summer theater, do stuff like that. But gradually, I was able to make enough from just writing, just the production or book royalties. And a lot of my stuff was published by then. So I didn't really have to travel. And I just got used to staying here.
So how often do you write? You have about, I guess, 420 plus plays credited to your name. Like, how often? I just can't imagine. When I was in grad school, I wrote a paper a week, and I thought that was too much. So how often are you sitting down and writing? And I know that to back it up a little bit, I know that a lot of your writing it comes from history, excuse me, with that weird emphasis, but it comes from history, and it comes from, actual life and actual events. So, the inspiration may come from that, but how often are you, sitting down and knocking out a play or a short play or something like that?
I write every day.
Okay.
I've always written every day. I mean, there have been some days, like when I was directing. When you're in a production, you're directing, it's very difficult for me to actually focus on something else while I'm directing something. But even then, I would always have a notebook with me, and I would scribble stuff that didn't make any sense. And when I got into a more peaceful place, then I would open up the notebook, and that would turn into something. So, no, I've always written. I wrote when I was a child. I was making up weird epics involving stuffed animals and toy soldiers and cowboys and playing cards before I could actually read and write. And once I could, I was writing all the time. When I went to college, I burned everything I wrote up to that point, which I regret now. I don't advise that. But at the time, it was very embarrassing, both because when you're about 16 or 17, your brain is developed enough so that you can read really great stuff, and also that you can look at your own stuff and say, man, I'm nowhere near there yet. I don't want anybody to see this. So I burned it all. But once I got to college, I started saving it. But I wrote all the time, and I thought I was going to be a novelist. And I was teaching at Ohio State after I got my degree. I didn't go to grad school. I was lucky enough to get a job teaching comparative literature as a lecturer at Ohio State for a couple of years. And it was very lonely. I'd teach during the day. I'd go home at night. I was living in a little red coach house thing. It was a very nice place for a writer to live. I was all alone. Most of the people I knew had graduated. And I was up there at night trying to write this novel, and it was just incredibly lonely. And I thought I was going to lose my mind. I'm a very introverted, shy person anyway, except when I'm doing theater. Then I'm not. But in every other human interaction, I am. And I remembered that theater was something I could always do without. It was one way I could relate to people, where I felt like I knew what I was doing, even though I didn't really know what I was doing, but I just felt that way. So I started at the university. I started working on sets and auditioning for shows, and I started getting cast, and I started directing things. And the last thing I did was take a playwriting course. And at the time, I was trying to write big, complicated, surreal plays with many characters, the sort of thing I write now, but I was trying to do it to begin with when
Right.
I was starting out. And I didn't really know how to do that yet. So I had a lot of unfinished plays that I finished years later. And in the playwriting class, the director, the teacher, a great guy named David Ayers, said he didn't like this sort of stuff anyway. He liked, Robert Anderson, let's sit in the kitchen and talk about our childhood kind
Yeah.
of American drama.
Sure.
Not my cup of tea. But he said, okay, look, you're trying to do stuff that's too complicated. You don't know how to do that yet. Write me a simple play, small cast, set with one location about people your own age and something you know about.
Right.
So I wrote Seascape with Sharks and Dancer. And he called me into his office and banged on the table and said, Don, I think you're going to be a playwright. And I didn't believe him, but a year later, I had my first production. And I've been writing plays ever since, watching that first production.
Yeah.
Watching the audience watch that first production. It just seemed like a miracle to me.
Right.
That you could take all this chaotic, meaningless suffering and stupidity that my life was built of, and I could sort of generate a play out of that and then give it to the director, who gave it to the actors, who embodied it in their own flesh, and then gave it to the audience. And these people could sit there absolutely rapt,
Yeah.
totally attentive, and laugh and cry and gasp. And all of a sudden, it was just an amazingly mystical kind of alchemical process. And I thought, wow, there's nothing
That's
like
cool.
this.
Yeah.
This is the way to actually get into people's souls
Yeah.
with stuff that otherwise would have just been meaningless crap that happened to you or that you heard about or whatever. So the writing became playwriting, and also being in the theater as opposed to being a novelist has given me a way to have a social life.
Right.
Because I'm not shy around actors and directors and theater people. I got to meet all these great girls, and I got to have all kinds of really interesting, crazy friends.
Yeah.
I never would have been able to do that if I'd stayed a novelist.
Now, do you write novels though? I mean, have you dabbled into that?
I've written 7 novels, and I have like 4 or 5 more almost finished, and I never really did much with them.
Okay.
I had like a series of, like, very briefly 3 different fiction agents, and I discovered soon that the fiction world is a totally different place than the theater world. Different agents, different publishers, but also different ideas about, what it makes sense to write.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just a whole different thing. And I didn't really have time or any interest in figuring that out.
Yeah.
What I have done is I've collected all these novels, and now I mine them for plays.
Right.
So someday, maybe someday I will do something with them. But for right now, it was a good experience, and it gave me infinite material, because many of the things that I wrote about in the novels, the characters and stories and like that, you can find 50 plays in one good novel.
Yeah.
So it was enjoyable. I've written pretty much every kind of thing.
How has your writing style changed, or not necessarily style, but I guess the process of which you write over the past few years as technology has changed? And you mentioned the notebook, but do you walk around still with a notebook, or do you now have a laptop, or how has that kind of morphed things for you and changed your way of writing, your process?
I went from writing longhand with an old fountain pen, an old blue fountain pen that smelled really good. I hated giving it up because it smelled so good. It was a mess. It leaked all over the place. It was awful. But I liked the smell of the ink, and I liked doing it. I went from that to a little Smith Corona portable typewriter, which I typed on for like 20-25 years, and until the letters, the little heads of the letters started popping off and hitting me in the face. It was so and I had to keep getting those letters soldered back on. So finally I got an electric typewriter, which I loathed. I hated the electric typewriter. And then I switched to a Mac, and I love the computer. And but I still scribble first. I still write. Almost everything starts longhand in a notebook, often in a very chaotic state. And then when it gets to a point where I've got enough there that I'm pretty sure it's going to be a play, then I switch to the computer. I type it into the computer. I rewrite as I'm typing it in the computer. I get myself a rough draft or something, and I print out as I go so I can scribble on what I'm printing out, because I have to scribble.
Right.
And gradually the horrible mess of scribbled on, printed out text gets cleaner and cleaner until it
Right.
feels like it's done.
So when does a play become yours? Like when do you know, okay, this is now a play, or I'm sure you have lots of parts of your process where you kind of thought, okay, this one I'm not as in love with this idea as I thought I would be. Let's move on to the next thing. When does a play like kind of make that turn and become your play? Does that make
Well,
sense?
it's more a question of, I mean, I never throw anything away and I never discard anything I try to
Not
write.
anymore. Not anymore.
I have maybe, I have maybe, I think there's like 35 unfinished plays, some of which date back to the early 70s, and some are
Wow.
from like last year.
Yeah.
So I've finished most of the things that I've started, but there's this percentage of them that I haven't, and I just keep pulling them out. When I finish something, I just pull out a notebook, a file folder. I have files here, and these are my unfinished ones sitting in here. And when I get done, I'll pull these out and I'll read through them again and I'll scribble on them. And one of them will just, if I'm lucky, sort of kind of catch fire in my head, and it'll keep going. If it doesn't, I start something else. But I don't ever discard anything, and it's never. It's always in my mind. There's a play there. Sometimes it takes me 30 years to find it. Sometimes it's
Wow.
there immediately.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like the play grabs you by the hand and is running, and you're just sort of trailing behind it, trying not to fall down.
Right.
But most of the time, it's not like that. Most of the time, it appears in fragments.
Right.
And it's like putting together a puzzle. But it can be anything. But no, once something's itching at the inside of my head, I write to figure out what it is.
Okay.
And most of writing is really, it's tapping my subconscious. I'm not a planner. I'm not a person who figures out ahead of time what the play is going to be and how it's going to end and like that. Sometimes I can see that. And if I can, I will make an outline no longer than like on one side of one sheet of paper, just so I don't forget it. But any kind of outline thing that's longer than that would be a waste of time for me. I'd rather write the scenes.
Right.
I'd rather go ahead and dive into
Just
the
go.
scenes than plan it out ahead of time. So it's largely a process of tapping my subconscious. Something, even some very apparently arbitrary external stimulus will open that door. Once that door to the subconscious opens, you just got to relax and let the stuff come out. And so I write it all down. And then once all that crap stops flying out of the inside of my head, then I have a whole lot of jungle of written stuff, which I look at and I see what kind of coherence it makes. And then I use the rational part of my brain to respectfully edit, rewrite, rearrange, figure out what's missing, figure out what doesn't belong there, stuff like that. But I try, the basis of it's the subconscious. All the good stuff is from the subconscious. It keeps surprising me. As long as it keeps surprising me, I know I'm on the right track.
Do you have somebody that you bounce ideas off of? Do you have, no, it's that subconscious thing, huh?
Yeah. I don't do that, and I don't do script development. I mean, I have in the past sometimes had readings and stage readings, which were very helpful. All theaters do this differently. But the process that is kind of taken over now of, okay, well, first we'll have a reading, and then we'll all tell you how to rewrite, and then we'll have a stage reading, and then we'll tell you how to rewrite again, and then we'll have a workshop production, and we'll all tell you how to rewrite again, and then maybe we'll decide not to produce it. That whole process is something that I don't like, and that I just don't do.
Yeah.
I think it's cost me a great deal in terms of productions, but I don't care. The point is you have to stay in touch with the way of working that works for you. One of the things that's delighted me recently, I've been having a lot of productions in Russia. I have a terrific Russian translator who works very fast, who loves my plays, and who knows where to send them. And in Russia, the process seems to be, he reads my play, he translates the play. He sends it not to the literary department where, four teenagers read it who are not being paid, who are slaves of the theater, and then maybe pass it upward. He sends it directly to the artistic director, who is a famous guy in Russia. This guy reads it. He says, I love this. We'll go into rehearsal in 3 weeks. And then they do the play. So that's more like the way I like to do it. And they do beautiful productions in Russia under very difficult circumstances, obviously.
Right.
So I prefer not to bounce things off
Right.
folks. I just trust my own stuff. And if people don't like it, they don't have to produce it.
Have you been over to Russia to see your work? No.
No, I've been to Germany and England. That's all. But
Yeah.
I've been produced. It's not just Russia too. There's
Yeah.
all the countries that were in the former Soviet Union. So I've had productions in Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan.
Wow.
There's a lot of Russians in Finland.
Yeah.
I've had productions in Finland and Russian, both from theaters that are Russian people and Ukrainians. A lot of Ukrainians have moved to Finland during the war.
Yeah.
And they started their own theater. So I had a production in Ukrainian in Finland.
Right.
But people from there, and so there's a plus. I get productions in other European countries, in Spain and France and places like that.
How long did it take for you to kind of find your style, or did you know the minute you wrote your first play, kind of that was the path you wanted to go? You don't think so?
I don't think I have a
Okay.
I mean, others might observe things that I'm not observing.
Yeah.
Every time I start something, from my point of view, I'm having to reinvent the whole process.
Okay.
I write every play differently. I use different conventions. I combine conventions. I invent conventions. I throw, I subvert conventions. The play, I just listen to the play and it shows me what to do. So I don't, there probably are certain things, there certainly are certain things
Yeah.
that you, if you sat down and examined it, you could see from play to play, well, here's a theme. Here's something he's
Sure.
obsessed with. There certainly are certain symbols and ideas and things that I return to again and again, but I don't know that there's a specific kind of play that I've written, because every story eventually reveals to me its own set of conventions, and I just use those.
Right. Is there?
So I've written big, complicated epics and monologues and fairly realistic,
Yeah.
traditional plays and plays that God knows who will ever understand them, and I don't care. I don't care whatever the subconscious tells me. I just follow that.
Is there a type of story that you think that you seek out, or is there is it just what you've kind of fallen into? If you, like you said, your subconscious, if it's saying go this direction and kind of write this story, then do it.
It's something itching inside my head.
Gotcha.
Often it's there before I know what it is,
Got
that
it.
I even know it's there. And sometimes a really arbitrary external thing can let it out.
Right.
An example would be a friend of mine, Mark Cuddy, took over as artistic director at the Idaho Shakespeare Festival a number of years ago. And he wanted to do a season of 2 Shakespeares and a 3rd play, which was kind of like Shakespeare, but which would give his big young apprentice company something fun to do. And it was, at the time, they were performing outdoors by the woods, and he got the idea. He said, "Can you write me a Robin Hood play for my apprentices to do?" Now, I never would have written a Robin Hood play.
Right.
I've always liked Robin Hood since I was a kid. I used to watch the TV series, and I read the ballads later and stuff like that. So it's a subject. I never would have written about that.
Right.
But that apparently arbitrary stimulus opened up something inside me,
Right.
which was at the time an extreme anger at and hatred of the Reagan administration. So I
Okay.
wrote a Robin Hood play, which was actually a very dark send up of the things I hated.
Right.
Censorship, the rape of the environment, the trickle-down economics,
Yeah.
everything I hated about the Reagan administration got into that Robin Hood play. Because,
Right.
Robin Hood he steals from the rich and gives to the poor. He does the opposite of trickle-down.
Right.
And so I did all that, but I was careful to do it in a way that the play would make sense even if nobody knew anything about that. And so this play is still being done by people who
Right.
weren't even born then.
Yeah.
And it still works, and it's still funny, and it still has, makes certain points. But that apparently arbitrary thing unleashed something inside me that I didn't know I needed to write
Right.
until it happened. And then, so ideally that'll work. If somebody wants me to do something and I know it won't do that, then I just won't do it. Around the same time, somebody wanted me to write a play extolling the virtues of uranium mining in Colorado. And I'm against uranium mining in Colorado.
Right. Yeah.
I don't like uranium mining in Colorado.
Good. Yeah. Yeah.
That I knew would close the door, not open the door, or the
Right.
play would turn out to be something they wouldn't use anyway.
So has the past year inspired you at all, as far as storytelling is concerned? It's been a heck of almost exactly a year since things have shut down, and plus with the political element, the civil rights element, has this past year kind of tickled at you to say, hey, we got to tell a little bit of a story here?
Well, I wrote for one of those collections of very short plays on a particular subject. It was a video sort of production type thing. I've had a bunch of those.
Yeah.
And I did write a play for one of those, and then I wrote 3 other little plays to go with it. So I have a little collection of plays about what it's like to be trapped in lockdown,
right,
and how people drive each other crazy. I imagine everybody was writing those plays,
yeah,
as all of us writers were, trapped in the sink. I don't know.
Yeah.
Things marinate inside for a long time, and I don't even know. I just write what comes out.
Yeah, so that I had this question up here too, and you've kind of already answered it to an extent, but is there a play or plays that have just given you the hardest time? And I know you've already mentioned, some kind of marinade for 30 years, but that may not be because it's difficult to write. But are there plays that you have completed that gave you a hard time, that just you had to get through that quote unquote writer's block, which exists somewhat for people, but not necessarily full-time writers? But yeah, is that a truth for you?
I prefer not to think of it as writers.
Yeah, I know, and I know that for a lot of writers.
It's healthier not to think about it that way. It's healthier to think about it as just it's there. I haven't found it yet.
Right.
And also, if something stops on me, I don't give up on it. I will keep sort of nudging it, trying different approaches, things like that. But if it really doesn't want to happen yet, I will put it aside and work on something else. And that's sort of my way of handling a play that seems like it just feels like it's not ready to let me know what happens next.
Okay.
Or sometimes it's just there's something wrong. It looks like a play. It's the right length for a play. It could be produced this way, but there's something wrong. I don't know what it is. Sometimes I know what's wrong and I don't know how to fix it. Sometimes I don't know what's wrong, but I know something's wrong. And I always just trust my instincts. I'll just put it aside. I'll put aside like 2 years of work if it's just doesn't feel like it's there. But that's the way I try to avoid just getting stuck.
Right.
Write something else.
Yeah.
And also the notebook. Here's my notebook. The notebook helps me because anytime the play I'm working on at the moment doesn't seem to want to go anywhere, I just flip back through that notebook, and there's stuff in there I forgot I put in there. In fact, there's a lot of stuff in there I forgot I put in there. I also keep a journal, and I can go back to those. I have journals going back to the early 70s, which I can go back. It's a gold mine of stuff that I forgot that I wrote, that I forgot I was interested in.
Right. Yeah.
So it's better for me to the way not to get stuck is to keep working, even if you're not working on what you thought you wanted.
Yeah.
And that way I can always work, even if what I end up with, I have no idea what I'm going to do with.
Right.
Doesn't matter. The process of continuing to write while connected to that inner place where the images come from is more important than whether or not I finish what I'm working on right now.
Right.
As long as I can keep that flowing, I'm okay.
Do you have any of your finished plays that you would like to go back and re-explore or continue, down the line?
Well, I don't go back and rewrite once they're done.
Okay.
But I do have long cycles of plays.
Right.
And this is one of the things that I've really enjoyed over the years. I have a long cycle of plays that started by accident.
Right.
When I realized that 2 plays I had written that had some kind of vague connection to my family's history could be connected by something.
Right.
And I ended up writing there must be 25 or 26 or maybe more plays in this cycle about this family in East Ohio.
Yeah.
It traces now from the 18th century to, I don't know, mid 20th century or somewhere further than that, actually. And I've loved interlinking those plays and working on the same characters at different ages in their lives. And sometimes I write about them when they're old, and then I try to imagine what it was like when they were young. Sometimes it's the reverse, and it's just fun. I've created a labyrinth of characters and history, which is so complicated that I've had to do I have a whole big fat notebook now, which is like the encyclopedia of these people. So I have their dates of birth, and it's insane. But I have their dates of birth and death, and what happens to them, and what plays they're in, so I don't forget. Because when you create this whole world of plays that interlock, a kind of labyrinth of plays, you don't want it to contradict itself.
Right. Right. Is that the count? It's Pendragon, or is it? Am I saying that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that an actual county?
Well, it's kind of like around here. I live in East Ohio. This is a rural county. I live by the woods. I sort of gradually bought some of the property around me so people wouldn't cut down the trees.
Right.
There's a big hill behind the house. It's a wooded hill that I go up and walk on. And I just bought the lot beside the house, and I'm going to plant trees there. There used to be trees there. Somebody cut them down. I'm going to plant trees there.
Right.
This is crazy for an old man to do, is plant trees, but that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend the rest of my days writing frantically, trying to finish my life's work and planting those trees over there.
Right.
So it's Pendragon County combines some places around here, a couple of towns especially that I've lived in around here, a lot of the genealogical research that I've done about my parents' families and things transformed into something a bit more mythic and strange. But it's I feel a really deep connection to those plays, and I've loved the complex interconnectedness of it all. You have to make each play work on its own, even if you don't know anything about any of the other plays. But then you also have an enormous subtextual resource because you know what happens in the other plays.
It's like the Kentucky cycle, kind of, in a way. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's like that.
Yeah. So is there a play that you wish maybe was more produced? I asked that because a director that I used to teach with years ago called you, and I don't remember what the show was, but or messaged you about a specific play, and you had said nobody ever does that play, and you were excited about it, according to him. And we just produced Horde Massacre in Boston, which I know quite a few people, when we would say that's a Don Nigro show, they had never heard of it. They've heard of, you have your go-tos, if you will. Is there a play that you would like to see produced more, a story that you would like to see told by either high schools or professionals or whatever that might be?
Well, there's lots of them.
Okay.
There's a large body of work. I was told I have a history of not taking really good advice.
Okay.
It worked out well for me.
Yeah.
Early in my career, I got the advice: don't write these big plays, these big cast plays, because they're too expensive in America. Nobody will produce them. And I ignored that advice and continued to write these big cast plays, which they were right. They sat around for the most part for a long time until somebody in Texas, whether it was King Hill or so, I think it was probably King Hill over in Amarillo, discovered one of them and put it on and got it into these contests. And suddenly there was a big market for all those big cast plays that nobody would do before. So now there's a whole world where that's sort of the people in it think that's what I do.
Yeah.
I was also told at the same time, more good advice I ignored was don't write monologue plays because they're boring and nobody wants to do them, and you can't make much off of them. And now during time of plague, those monologue plays work beautifully.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just done on Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you've created a large enough library, eventually people will get to all of it.
So an awful lot of my plays, they're available at the Samuel French website, the published ones, and then there's a whole bunch of them available there that are still in manuscript that haven't got around to publishing yet. And a lot of those plays just get lost. I mean, there's just too many. There's too many for French to publish. There's too many for anybody else to publish. There's too many of them. But I can't help it. I have to keep doing it and hope that eventually they'll make their way out into the world. So there's a bunch of plays like that, and there's a bunch of plays that that from my point of view, you're not always the best judge of your own work probably, but from my point of view are some of my best work that nobody's done yet. One of the things I like about the Russians is that they're doing some of those really difficult plays that Americans look at and say, what the hell is that? You know, and the Russians say, I understand this. I think it may have something to do with the fact that they've had such a tragic history.
Yeah.
And it's been so difficult to be an artist in Russia. I mean, you have to really want to be an artist to be an artist there, because you could get killed, you know. And they do such beautiful work, but they're drawn to some of the plays that are more complicated, more difficult, and that combine the tragic with the wildly funny. The Russians have a good sense of the mixture of tragedy and comedy that you'll find, I think, if you really look, in King Lear or Hamlet, or, I mean, Shakespeare knew how to do this. And sometimes people they play down the humor in the tragedies, but that's just absolutely the wrong thing to do. If you're doing King Lear, it should be funny. It should be horrifying and funny and beautiful and strange and scary, but it should also be fun. And the Russians seem to have a good sense of that Americans sometimes want everything to be clear. So some of the plays that I like the most are the ones that are very complicated and that mix genres and mix feelings and do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I just, you know, somebody will do them somewhere.
Someday. So I know you went to the University of Iowa for your master's degree, and you were in the playwrights workshop. Does that still exist?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And
they have a fiction workshop, a poetry workshop, and a playwrights workshop. Yeah.
Okay. And explain that. I mean, I happen to see that in passing. And when I was in undergrad, Edward Albee was our resident playwright at the University of Houston. And so I got to, I am no playwright, but I tried to be one. I faked my way through college as a writer a little bit, because how do you not just sit there and take in what Albee, has to say. And so that was one of those things that was our quote unquote playwright workshop, was sitting with him and also Stuart Ostro, who was on the musical side. But what was playwright workshop, or what is playwright workshop at University of Iowa? And is that what kind of catapulted you to I know you mentioned earlier about putting the play on the desk and your professor saying you're going to be you're a playwright, but is playwright workshop what really kind of lit the fire?
No, that was the last sort of step rather than the first. That happened at Ohio State when I was teaching there just after I was an undergrad.
So before University of Iowa.
Yeah. And then I went to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst for a couple of years, and that's where I had my first productions. Very good productions, better than most of the professional productions I've had since. And I was lucky. I had terrific directors. Then I took a year off, and then I went to the playwrights workshop at Iowa. Now, the workshop at Iowa it's quite famous, actually. A guy named E.C. Mabey, a long time ago, I think it was in the 30s or something, decided he wanted to create a playwrights workshop to go with the fiction and the poetry and like that. And so he started this, and one of his early students was Tennessee Williams, who they threw out. He hated Tennessee Williams and threw him out. So it didn't have a great start. But a lot of very good people have come through there then, and it was great for me. Oscar Brownstein, who later ran the playwriting program at Yale, he ran the playwrights workshop when I was there. They took 12 people all together in the program, four new playwrights a year. It was a 3-year Master of Fine Arts program, and you'd read each other plays and you'd talk about them. And he had a particular theory about how plays are generated and what the relationship between the audience and the play is, which I still think is quite brilliant. I used to argue with him all the time about it, but it's very useful to me to if I don't know what I'm doing at some point, to say, what would Aki Brownstein say about this? So he had his own rather brilliant, he has a book called Strategies of the Drama, if anybody's interested, which is very much worth reading. But he was really helpful to me and he was challenging, and he would give you hell if you thought you were getting a big head. So he would encourage
Yeah.
you with. Um, got from Aki was the first production I had at Iowa was a play. Nobody understood what the hell it was about. And Aki came up to me after the show and he said, "You do everything wrong, but you do it brilliantly." He walked away. And that was the kind of guy he was. He would attack you, and then he would help you, and then he was great. He would have cut off his arms for you if he thought.
Right.
So I spent 3 years there. It was a great place to get productions. Mostly I was in school to get productions, because when you first start out, the most important thing for a playwright is to be in production. Just be in production as much as you can. You need to act,
Yeah.
you need to direct, you need to work on sets, whatever you can do, but you need to have your work done. And you need a place to do that. And what the graduate school at UMass in Amherst, and then later on at Iowa did for me was it gave me a chance to have all these productions. There were actors there for free. They were really good actors. And I was able to sort of learn how to do stuff by having all these productions there. And when I graduated from there, I was already having professional productions before I left Iowa.
Right.
And I just started my life as a wandering playwright. And then later I had an NEA grant, and Aki had moved to Yale to teach playwriting at Yale.
Yep.
And so I went there. He got me there for one semester, and I sat in on the workshop at Yale and watched him work with his own playwrights, who were wonderful people who've done well. And Frances McDormand was there in the program as an actor, and Jane Kaczmarek and Lila Robbins, and lots of very talented people were there, and I got to meet a lot of folks. And so I owe a lot to Aki Brownstein.
Right.
But that program at Iowa is still there and going strong and producing, I presume, more good playwrights. It gives you a place to be for 3 years,
Right.
and get lots of productions. And Aki said, you don't learn in the workshops. He said, you don't learn so much from what other people say about your work as from what you hear yourself saying about their work.
Ah.
He said, so don't worry too much about the criticisms that you get in this workshop. People are saying things for all kinds of reasons, but pay attention to what you hear yourself saying about them.